in the silence of Egypt's scorching desert, beneath the shadow of the pyramids, a forgotten pharaoh's name was once spoken in reverence. But what if I told you that his name, now lost to time, was once tied to a curse, so powerful, so dreadful, that it would bring ruin not only upon his dynasty, but 2 generations of those who followed him? This is a story that spans centuries, a tale of power, greed, and the gods' unforgiving wrath. For this ruler, blinded by ambition, sought to harness forces beyond human comprehension, forces that, in the end, would consume him and his bloodline in the most tragic way imaginable. What happens when a king, intoxicated by his own greatness, dares to challenge the very gods? What happens when hubris fuels a curse that lingers for eternity, staining every monument, every name, every soul tied to that fallen dynasty? Before we begin, if you're fascinated by tales of ancient Egypt and the tragic fates that befell its rulers, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you daren't miss any more spine-chilling stories from the past. Chapter 1. The Pharaoh's Hubris and the Curse Unleashed. The name of Pharaoh Amenhetep II was once spoken in awe by his people, a ruler whose ambitions knew no bounds. He was the last of the great Egyptian kings, whose power was unquestioned and whose reign seemed unstoppable. He rose to the throne with a vision of Egypt that few could match, and his grandeur was unrivaled. Yet, beneath the surface of his reign, a reign that stretched the borders of the empire, amassed wealth beyond imagination, and commanded the loyalty of the gods themselves, there brewed a storm. It was not an external enemy that would undo Amenhetep's kingdom, nor would it be his own armies that would betray him. It was his own vanity, his unshakable belief that he, and he alone, could master the forces of the gods. Amenhetep's arrogance was not uncommon among kings of his stature. His divine lineage had been declared by the priests since the earliest days of his reign, and his people viewed him as a living god. For many, he was the embodiment of Horus, the god of kingship and power. But as time went on, the pharaoh began to believe it himself. In the opulence of his court, surrounded by gold and jewels, his ego swelled to such proportions that he no longer saw himself as a ruler chosen by the gods, but as a god himself, one who could not only walk among them, but also command their power. The first signs of his hubris manifested in the construction of an extraordinary temple. This wasn't a simple place of worship for the gods, but a grand edifice designed to showcase Amenhetep's own divinity. It was to be a place where he could commune with the gods on his own terms, rather than follow the rituals prescribed by the priests. The temple was filled with depictions of the pharaoh, not as a humble servant of the gods, but as a powerful deity in his own right, stronger than any of the ancient gods, his eyes forever burning with divine fire. His likeness adorned every wall, and his name was inscribed in every stone. The temple was a monument to his greatness, his power, his immortality. But the gods, it seems, did not share his vision. In the deepest chambers of this new temple, Amenhetep began to experiment with rituals that had been forbidden for millennia. These were not the prayers or sacrifices that had been passed down through the ages. These were darker, older practices, rituals that predated even the first dynasty. His priests, too frightened by the scope of these practices, began to distance themselves, leaving Amenhetep to practice alone. It was in these secret moments, when the pharaoh was alone in the darkness, that the whispers began. Some say that it was in the silence of the night, when the moon was full, that Amenhetep first called out to the gods of the underworld, seeking the power of the ancient dead. He sought not only to command the heavens, but to reach beyond them, to the forgotten realms where the spirits of the dead resided. It is said that the walls of the temple seemed to pulse with energy, as though they were alive, as though something responded to the pharaoh's summons. He did not know it at the time, but in his quest for ultimate power, Amenhetep had made a terrible mistake. He had not called upon the gods. He had awoken something darker, something older than the gods themselves, an entity whose hunger for souls could not be satisfied. The curse he unleashed that night would not only haunt him, but would bring ruin to his bloodline for generations. The following days were filled with strange occurrences. The once peaceful city of Thebes became a place of whispers and fear. The weather turned unnatural. Thunderstorms broke out with no warning. The Nile began to flood at odd intervals, and the crops failed despite the usual bounty of the land. The people grew uneasy, and murmurs of a curse began to circulate. But it wasn't until Amenhetep's firstborn son, Prince Amen, fell ill that the true nature of the curse revealed itself. Amen was young, vibrant, and beloved by the people. He was the future of Egypt, and his death would strike a blow to the heart of the kingdom. The pharaoh, desperate to save his son, turned to the very gods he had sought to control, pleading with them for mercy. But there was no mercy to be found. The boy's body withered in the royal chambers, his once bright eyes clouding over with an unnatural glaze, his skin turning an ashen grey, as if the life was slowly being drained from him. No healer, no priest, could offer any cure. They whispered in fear that the curse of Amenhetep had already begun to take its toll. On the day that Amen died, the sky above Thebes turned dark, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the loss. The people gathered in silence, their hearts heavy with grief, as the young prince was laid to rest in a tomb that would never see the light of day again. The grief of the people soon turned to fear, for it was no longer just the king who was affected by the curse. It had now claimed his heir, and if the firstborn had died, who would be next? The secondborn, another young prince, was crowned in Amen's place, but his reign was fraught with misfortune. Soon after his ascension, the kingdom fell into chaos. Foreign enemies pressed on all sides, seeking to take advantage of Egypt's sudden instability. The once feared Egyptian armies were defeated in battle after battle. The royal treasury was drained, and the palace itself fell into disrepair. But the worst was yet to come. It was on the eve of a grand festival, meant to mark a moment of recovery for the kingdom, that Amenhetep received a terrible vision of his own death. The gods, he believed, had abandoned him, but something far worse had come to replace them. It was in this vision that the curse he had unleashed took form, an unrelenting wave of destruction that would sweep away his kingdom, his family, and his legacy. In the days that followed, the palace became a place of paranoia. The king's advisors, fearing for their lives, turned against each other. Servants whispered of strange occurrences in the royal chamber's lights, flickering shadows that moved of their own accord, and voices calling out in the night. The pharaoh became consumed by fear, doubting everyone, even his closest allies. His reign, once marked by pride and grandeur, had become a reign of terror to reign, not from enemies, but from the forces he himself had summoned. Soon after, during a meeting with his generals, Amenhetep ordered a massacre of suspected traitors. His soldiers, now terrified of the curse he had brought upon them, followed his orders blindly. The once glorious palace grounds became soaked in blood, and the whispers of the dead seemed to grow louder with each passing day. The people could not escape the fear that hung in the air. It was as though the curse had infected everything it touched, seeping into the very bones of the land. In the final days of his reign, Amenhetep's despair reached its peak. He turned to the ancient tombs of the great kings before him, seeking answers from those who had passed into the afterlife. In his desperation, he ordered the opening of forgotten tombs, hoping to commune with the spirits of the dead, to ask for guidance, or perhaps for some way to end the curse. But the tombs were not kind. They, too, had been sealed by the gods for a reason, and to disturb them would be to invite further ruin. It was said that on the night before his death, Amenhetep went alone to the tomb of his ancestors. The very earth seemed to tremble as he entered, as though the land itself recoiled at the pharaoh's presence. He emerged hours later, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. When asked what he had seen, he refused to speak, and soon after, he was found dead in his chambers, struck down by an unknown ailment. His body cold and unmarked, as though the life had simply been drained from him. The curse of Amenhetep had taken its final toll, but even in death, the legacy of his hubris lived on, waiting to claim those who came after him. And the people of Egypt, once filled with hope for a bright future, now lived in constant fear of the wrath of the gods. Chapter 2: The Dynasty's Descent and the Curse's Eternal Grip. The death of the forgotten pharaoh was not the end of his story. His name would fade into the shadows of history, his monuments would crumble, and his kingdom would be forgotten by time. But the curse he unleashed did not die with him. It lingered, hidden, insidious, festering in the bloodline that followed. It clung to his heirs like a shadow, marking them with an inevitable fate that no ruler could escape. As the years passed, the curse became a silent presence in the halls of the royal palace. It whispered through the stone walls, echoed through the minds of the pharaohs who sat upon the throne, and stained the very air they breathed. Each descendant of the cursed king carried the weight of his sins, and with that burden came the sure knowledge that death and destruction were never far behind. They would die violently, unexpectedly, or at the hands of their own people, letchfall as tragic as the last, each life extinguished too soon. The first of these unfortunate heirs was the pharaoh's second son, a boy who ascended to the throne in the wake of his older brother's mysterious death. He was young, strong, and brimming with the desire to prove that he could overcome the horrors that had plagued his father's reign. But even his strength could not defy the curse that had been set in motion. In his early years as ruler, the second pharaoh sought to restore Egypt to its former glory, rallying his people with grand plans for irrigation projects and military conquests. But as the years wore on, disaster struck once more. During an ambitious campaign in the deserts of Nubia, his army was ambushed by a coalition of rival tribes. What should have been a swift victory turned into a massacre, his soldiers slaughtered to the last man, leaving the young pharaoh stranded in a foreign land, exposed to the elements. Legend has it that, in the moments before his death, he cried out for the help of his ancestors, but his cries were swallowed by the sand, lost to the wind. The curse had claimed yet another victim, leaving behind only the barren wasteland of Nubia as the final resting place for the pharaoh who believed he could break free of his father's legacy. But even after his death, the curse continued to wreak havoc. As the generations passed, the fate of the pharaoh's descendants only grew bleaker. A third pharaoh, known for his wisdom and revered for his ability to maintain Egypt's prosperity, fell victim to paranoia, convinced that every shadow in his court was a harbinger of betrayal. He surrounded himself with spies, trusting no one, not even his own family. He would spend sleepless nights pacing the royal halls, clutching his scepter like a lifeline, whispering in dread that the curse of his bloodline was closing in. It was not the sword that claimed him, but madness. One fateful night, after a particularly disturbing vision of his ancestors' wrath, the third pharaoh retreated to his private chambers. His guards found him in the morning, lifeless, a faint smile on his lips, as though he had finally come to terms with the horrors that haunted him. The curse had taken him, not in the manner of kings who met their deaths in battle, but in the most insidious way possible, through the slow erosion of his mind. The fourth and fifth pharaohs were no less affected. The fourth, a woman who rose to power during a time of great unrest, found herself besieged by revolt. The people of Egypt, long suffering under the weight of years of misfortune, began to turn against the royal family. Whispers of the curse spread through the streets like wildfire. In a desperate bid to retain control, she ordered the execution of anyone suspected of plotting against her. Her reign became one of fear, suspicion, and cruelty. Yet, despite her iron-fisted rule, she met the same fate as the pharaohs before her assassination, orchestrated by her own trusted servants, who had finally had enough of the dynasty's blood-soaked reign. The fifth pharaoh, the last of the cursed line, was the youngest of them, all a mere child, when he ascended the throne after the death of his mother. But even his innocence could not shield him from the curse that had ravaged his family. His reign was short-lived, marked only by a series of bizarre occurrences, strange omens in the sky, the river flooding in unnatural patterns, and the people becoming more and more restless. He died mysteriously, his body found in the royal garden, surrounded by the same sandstorms that had heralded the fall of his grandfather. It is said that on the night of his death, the skies above Egypt turned a deep blood-red hue, as if the gods themselves had wept for the last of the cursed pharaohs. His death was the final stroke in a legacy of horror that had stretched across generations, leaving nothing but death and devastation in its wake. But the curse, unlike the pharaohs themselves, did not die with the last of the bloodline. It lived on, carried in the whispers of the people, in the forgotten monuments scattered across Egypt. The land, once ruled by the gods themselves, had become a place where the gods seemed to have turned their backs on mankind. The tale of the cursed dynasty would be passed down through the ages as a warning, a dark legend that would echo through the halls of Egypt's temples for centuries to come. The story of a ruler who sought to defy the gods, only to bring ruin upon himself and his children. And though the pharaoh's name may be lost to history, the curse he set into motion still lingers in the sands of time, reminding all who come after him that even the greatest rulers cannot escape the wrath of those they have wronged. As the last embers of the dynasty's fire burned out, the story of the forgotten pharaoh lived on, not as a tale of glory, but as a testament to the fragility of power. His curse, once cast with such fiery conviction, continues to haunt the land of Egypt, echoing through the deserts, whispered on the winds that sweep through the ancient temples and ruins. The gods, it seems, were not so easily defied, and for the pharaoh who thought he could control their wrath, the ultimate price was his soul and the lives of his children, his heirs, and his empire. In the end, the curse was not simply a punishment for one man's arrogance. It was a reflection of the inescapable truth that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how great, can stand forever against the forces of destiny. The forgotten pharaoh may have been consumed by the darkness of his own making, but the legacy of his hubris still lingers, hidden in the very earth of Egypt, waiting to be remembered.